Was Nancy Guthrie specifically targeted? Did someone know Nancy's routines, vulnerabilities, and schedule? February 1st, 2026. 2:12 in the morning. A masked man approaches the front porch of an 84-year-old woman's home in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson, Arizona. The man is dressed entirely in black. Ski mask, gloves, a backpack, armed. And here's what makes this moment significant. The man doesn't hesitate at the property entrance. Doesn't pause to get their bearings. Doesn't search the front of the house looking for security cameras. Instead, he walked directly to the doorbell camera mounted beside the front door, in complete darkness, and immediately began tampering with it. No searching, no scanning, no uncertainty. He knew exactly where that camera was. The FBI released this doorbell footage to the public on February 10, 2026, 9 days after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing from this home. The still images and short video clip show those critical seconds. A masked intruder, moving with purpose, disabling the one piece of technology that could have recorded what happened next. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for over 4 months. She's 84 years old. She has medical conditions that require daily medication. She has limited mobility. And according to law enforcement, the evidence at the scene, including her own blood, confirmed by DNA testing, indicates she did not leave her home willingly. This is not a story about what happened to Nancy Guthrie that night. Law enforcement is still working to answer that question. And as of this recording, no arrests have been made in her abduction. This is a story about a different question. A question that sits at the center of how investigators approach cases like this. Was Nancy Guthrie specifically targeted? Did someone choose her in advance? Did someone study her routines, her vulnerabilities, her schedule? Did someone watch her home, learn her patterns, and wait for the right moment? Or was this a crime of opportunity? A random act by someone who happened upon an elderly woman living in an affluent neighborhood? The difference matters. Because if Nancy was randomly selected, the suspect pool is almost limitless. But if she was deliberately chosen, then someone had to acquire specific knowledge about her life. And that knowledge had to come from somewhere. This is the Last Case Records. This channel exists to examine evidence carefully, analytically, and without jumping to conclusions. Everything I'm about to show you comes from FBI releases, law enforcement statements, verified news reporting, and public records. Every source will be cited. You can check them yourself. We're not here to accuse anyone. We're here to analyze behavior. And the behavior in this case tells a very specific story about preparation. By the end of this video, you're going to see why investigators often examine the possibility of targeting in cases like this. You're going to see what kind of knowledge would have been required to do what was done. And you're going to see why the question of who knew what becomes the central investigative focus. Let's get into it. When law enforcement responds to a missing person case involving an elderly victim, one of the first questions they ask is this: did the offender choose this victim in advance, or was this opportunistic? It's not an abstract question. It determines investigative strategy. Crimes of opportunity look a certain way. The offender encounters the victim by chance. They make quick decisions. They improvise. They take what's immediately available and leave. The crime scene often shows hesitation, disorganization, evidence of uncertainty. Targeted crimes look different. There's preparation. There's specific knowledge about the victim. There's planning that accounts for security measures, timing, and logistics. The crime scene often shows confidence, efficiency, and decision-making that suggests the offender had thought through the steps in advance. In Nancy Guthrie's case, we're examining evidence that suggests preparation. That doesn't mean we know who did this. It doesn't mean we're accusing anyone. It means we're looking at what the evidence tells us about how much the offender knew, and when they knew it. So what does targeting require? First, it requires knowledge of the victim's vulnerabilities. Age, physical condition, medical needs, living situation. An offender who targets a specific victim usually knows whether that victim can physically resist, whether they live alone, whether they have medical limitations that make them easier to control. Second, it requires knowledge of routine. When does the victim come and go? When are they alone? When are they expected somewhere? And when would their absence be noticed? Offenders who plan abductions often choose timing that maximizes their window before the victim is reported missing. Third, it requires knowledge of security. Are there cameras? Alarms? Neighbors who pay attention? Dogs? An offender who plans in advance accounts for these factors. An offender who acts impulsively often doesn't. Fourth, it requires knowledge of the household. Who lives there? Who visits? Who has keys? Who checks in regularly? These details matter because they determine risk. The more an offender knows about the household, the better they can time their approach to avoid detection. And fifth, in cases involving ransom, it requires financial knowledge. What can the family actually pay? What's realistic versus aspirational? A stranger making assumptions based on Google searches might demand an absurd amount. Someone with actual knowledge of the family's financial reality might calculate more precisely. Now, here's why this matters in Nancy Guthrie's case. Nancy wasn't encountered on the street. She wasn't taken from a parking lot or a public place. She was taken from inside her home, late at night on a specific date, during a specific window of time when she was alone. Her personal belongings, glasses, phone, bank cards, were left behind. The offender didn't search the house for valuables. They came for Nancy. Blood evidence confirmed by DNA testing was found at the scene, indicating she didn't leave voluntarily. And doorbell camera footage shows an offender who moved with confidence on a property they appeared to know. So the question becomes, how much would someone need to know to do what was done to Nancy Guthrie? And where does that kind of knowledge come from? We're going to examine 6 categories of evidence. Camera behavior, physical vulnerability, timing, household circumstances, ransom calculation, and the overall pattern of preparation. Each category on its own might be explained away, but together they create a picture of an offender who came prepared. Let's start with what happened at 2:12 a.m. On February 10, 2026, the FBI released still images and video footage recovered from Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera. The footage shows a single masked man. Male, based on FBI's analysis. Estimated height between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches. Average build. Dressed entirely in black. Wearing a ski mask, nitrile gloves, and carrying what the FBI identified as an Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack. A handgun is visible, holstered at the waist. The timestamp on the footage is 2:12 a.m., February 1st, 2026. This is approximately 4 hours after Nancy was last seen being dropped off at her home by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, around 9:50 p.m. on January 31st. Now, let's talk about what this footage shows in terms of behavior. The man approaches the front porch. There's no visible hesitation. No pausing at the property line. No moment where the man stops to orient themselves or scan the area. They walk directly toward the camera. Not toward the front door first, toward the camera. And here's the detail that matters. They don't search for the camera. They don't look around the porch area trying to locate it. They move straight to it, in darkness, and begin tampering with it immediately. According to the FBI's description of the footage, the man attempts to disable the camera by tapping on the lens. When that doesn't work, they reach into a potted plant position near the camera and use foliage to cover the lens. Let's stop there for a moment. The man knew the potted plant was there. They knew where it was positioned relative to the camera. They didn't fumble around in the dark looking for something to use. They went directly to that plant. Behavioral analysts who examine surveillance footage look for something called orientation behavior. It's the way people move in unfamiliar spaces versus familiar ones. When you approach a location you've never been to before, especially in the dark, your body language shows it. You slow down. You scan. You look for landmarks. You hesitate before making decisions about where to step, what to touch, how to proceed. When you approach a location you're familiar with, you move differently. You don't think about where things are, you just know. Your movements become automatic. You navigate based on muscle memory. The man in this footage moved like someone who knew the layout of that porch. Now, let's address the obvious question. Could this have been luck? Could the man have just happened to notice the camera and happened to find the plant in the moment? It's possible. We have to acknowledge that. But think about the circumstances. It's 2:12 in the morning. It's dark. The man is wearing a ski mask, which limits peripheral vision. They're also wearing gloves, carrying a backpack, and armed. Their hands aren't free to easily search around. And yet within seconds of arriving on that porch, they've located the camera and neutralized it. The FBI released this footage because they believed the public might recognize the suspect's build, clothing, or movement patterns. But what the footage also reveals is something about preparation. The offender came to that property knowing a camera existed. Think about what that means. External doorbell cameras aren't always visible from the street, especially at night. Some are mounted in recessed areas. Some are small and blend into the architecture. Unless you're standing relatively close to the front door, you might not notice them at all. So how did this person know? There are really only two possibilities. First, they had scouted the property beforehand. They had walked past or driven past or approached close enough during daylight hours to spot the camera and note its location. That would mean this wasn't an impulsive act. It would mean they had prepared. Second, someone told them. Someone who had been to this property, who had noticed the camera, who could describe where it was and how it was positioned. That would mean inside knowledge. Both possibilities point away from random, opportunistic crime. But there's another layer to this that doesn't get discussed enough. Nancy's doorbell camera system was a Nest camera. And here's the detail that should make you pause. According to investigative reporting, Nancy's Nest system did not have an active cloud subscription at the time of the abduction. What does that mean? Nest cameras can function in two ways. With a cloud subscription, they continuously record and upload footage to remote servers, where it's stored and can be accessed later. Without a subscription, they can still detect motion and send alerts to a connected phone, but they don't store continuous footage. Nancy's system was in the second category. The cameras were installed. They were powered on. They could detect motion, but they weren't actively recording to the cloud. The FBI had to work with Google, the company that owns Nest, to recover residual data from back-end servers. Data that hadn't been fully overwritten yet. It was a technical recovery process that pulled fragments of footage from what should have been a system that wasn't recording. Think about what that implies. An offender who knew the cameras weren't actively recording would have behaved very differently than an offender who thought they were being filmed. If you think you're on camera, you either avoid the camera entirely, or you disable it as quickly as possible, knowing that footage is already being stored remotely and you need to minimize what's captured. If you know the camera isn't recording, or if you believe it isn't, you might still disable it out of caution, but you do so without the same urgency. The man in this footage doesn't appear panicked. They don't rush. They approach methodically and tamper with the camera in a way that suggests they expected it to be there, but they didn't expect it to be a major obstacle. Now, how would someone know that Nancy's cameras weren't actively recording? That's not information you can get from standing on the street. That's not something you can research online. That's inside knowledge. That's the kind of detail you'd only know if you'd been inside the home, or if someone who had been inside the home told you. We need to be careful here. We don't know for certain that the offender knew about the subscription status. It's possible they disabled the camera out of general caution, not specific knowledge. But the pattern is worth noting. The confidence. The direct approach. The knowledge of where the camera was and where the plant was. The calm, methodical tampering. It all points to someone who had thought this through. And the camera behavior is just the beginning. Because what the offender knew about Nancy herself is even more specific. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. According to law enforcement statements, she's described as a vulnerable adult, with limited mobility and medical needs that require daily medication. She lived in her own home in the Catalina foothills, an affluent area north of Tucson. But she didn't live with around-the-clock care. She maintained her independence, attended church regularly, and had family who checked in on her. So here's the question. How would an offender know that Nancy was physically vulnerable? Age is visible. If you see an 84-year-old woman, you can make certain assumptions about physical capability. But limited mobility and specific medical conditions aren't always obvious from a distance. Nancy attended church. She moved through her daily life. To a casual observer, she might have appeared like many other elderly women. Aging, yes, but not necessarily incapacitated. But the offender who took Nancy appears to have known something more specific. And we know this because of what was left behind. When law enforcement arrived at Nancy's home on February 1st, after she was reported missing when she didn't show up for church that morning, they found her personal belongings inside the house. Her glasses, her phone, her bank cards. These are items an elderly person needs for daily function. If Nancy had left the house voluntarily, she would have taken them. If she'd been planning to go somewhere, even under duress, she likely would have grabbed her phone or wallet. But everything was there. On February 5, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos held a press conference and confirmed that blood had been found at the scene. DNA testing matched it to Nancy Guthrie. The amount of blood hasn't been publicly disclosed, but its presence indicates some level of physical confrontation or injury. Nancy didn't simply walk out of her home. Something happened that caused her to bleed. And yet, according to investigators, there was no sign of ransacking. The house wasn't torn apart. Valuables weren't missing. This wasn't a burglary that escalated. The offender came for Nancy, not for property. Let's think about what that means from an operational perspective. If you're planning to abduct an 84-year-old woman from her home, you need to account for certain realities. First, can she physically resist? Can she run? Can she fight back effectively? An 84-year-old woman with limited mobility cannot do those things the way a younger, healthier person could. That makes her, in the cruelest possible terms, an easier target. But you'd only target her specifically if you knew about her limitations in advance. Otherwise, why take the risk of entering a home when you could encounter anyone? A younger family member, a caregiver, someone who could resist more effectively. Second, can she be moved from the house without attracting attention? Nancy had limited mobility. If she couldn't walk long distances on her own, the offender would have needed to support her weight, carry her, or use some other method to transport her from inside the house to a vehicle. That requires physical capability on the offender's part, yes. But it also requires knowledge that this is what you're going to need to do. If you show up expecting to walk someone out at gunpoint and you discover they can't walk, you're now improvising under enormous stress. The plan has already failed. But if you show up knowing you'll need to physically manage someone with limited mobility, you've prepared for that. The blood evidence suggests Nancy didn't go quietly. There was some level of struggle or injury. But she was still removed from the home, because she's gone. That takes planning. Third, what about her medical needs? Nancy requires daily medication for conditions that, according to investigative reporting, could become life-threatening without treatment. If someone abducted Nancy with the intent to keep her alive for ransom purposes, they would need to account for those medical needs. That means knowing what medication she takes, knowing what conditions she has, possibly even acquiring those medications in advance or knowing how to manage her condition well enough to keep her stable. That's not information a stranger has. You don't walk up to someone's house, randomly select an elderly victim, and just happen to be prepared for their specific medical needs. That requires prior knowledge. Now, let's address the alternative explanation. It's possible the offender didn't care about Nancy's medical needs. It's possible they took her without any intention of keeping her alive long-term. In that scenario, medical knowledge wouldn't have been necessary. But even in that scenario, you still have the problem of vulnerability targeting. Why this house? Why this woman? The Catalina foothills area has many homes, many residents. If this was truly random, if an offender was just driving through looking for an opportunity, they could have chosen any number of properties. But they chose Nancy's. And the evidence suggests they came prepared for exactly what they found. An elderly woman alone with limited mobility, in a house they appeared to already know the layout of. That's not random. There's a pattern in criminal behavior research that's relevant here. It's called victim selection bias. Offenders who target elderly victims often do so because they perceive them as low-risk, high-reward opportunities. Low risk because the victim is less likely to resist physically. High reward because elderly victims in affluent areas are often assumed to have wealth, or to have family members with wealth. But for that calculation to work, the offender needs to know the victim is elderly, vulnerable, and connected to wealth. All three of those things were true about Nancy Guthrie. She was 84. She had limited mobility. And her daughter is Savannah Guthrie, anchor of NBC's Today Show, one of the most recognizable journalists in America. How does an offender acquire all three pieces of that puzzle? If you're surveilling from outside the property, you might observe that an elderly woman lives there. You might notice her routine over time, but you wouldn't necessarily know her exact physical limitations. You wouldn't know her medical needs. And you wouldn't necessarily know who her daughter is unless you did research. If you're connected to the family, even distantly, you'd know all of it. You'd know Nancy's age and condition. You'd know Savannah's public profile. You'd know the family's general financial situation. You'd have context that a stranger wouldn't have. And here's where we need to be very clear about what we're saying and what we're not saying. Law enforcement publicly cleared all of Nancy's immediate family members on February 24, 2026. Sheriff Nano stated explicitly, "All Guthrie siblings and their spouses have been cleared as possible suspects." We're not suggesting family involvement. We're not suggesting anyone close to Nancy did this. What we're examining is how an offender could have acquired the knowledge they clearly possessed. And one of the ways knowledge travels is through social circles. If you know someone who knows someone who has access to a family, information can filter outward. A casual conversation about someone's elderly mother. A mention of medical issues. A comment about a daughter's high-profile career. Information that seems harmless in normal context can become operational intelligence in the wrong hands. The offender who took Nancy knew enough about her to target her specifically. The question isn't whether family was involved. Law enforcement has answered that. The question is, who else had access to that knowledge? And before we can answer that, we need to look at timing. Because when this happened is just as revealing as how it happened. Let's establish the timeline with precision. Because in cases like this, timing is evidence. January 31st, 2026. Saturday night. Nancy Guthrie was dropped off at her home by her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, at approximately 9:50 p.m. This is the last confirmed sighting of Nancy by someone law enforcement has identified and cleared. February 1st, 2026. Early morning. At 2:12 a.m., doorbell camera footage captures the masked man tampering with a camera on Nancy's front porch. This gives us a window. Between 9:50 p.m. on January 31st and 2:12 a.m. on February 1st, approximately 4 hours and 22 minutes, Nancy was home, alone, and unaccounted for. February 1st, 2026. Late morning. Nancy attended church regularly. When she didn't arrive for the morning service on February 1st, a member of her church congregation became concerned and contacted authorities around 11 a.m. Shortly after, Nancy's family called 911 around noon to report her missing. So from the time of the abduction, sometime around or after 2:12 a.m., until she was reported missing around noon, approximately 10 hours passed. 10 hours before anyone outside the home knew Nancy was gone. Now let's talk about what that timing tells us. First, Nancy was alone that night. She didn't live with family members full-time. Tommaso Cioni dropped her off and left. There's no indication anyone else was staying at the house that night. So here's the question. How did someone know Nancy would be alone? If you're surveilling a property, you can observe patterns over time. You can notice when people come and go. You can identify who lives there and who visits. But knowing that a specific person will be alone on a specific night requires more detailed knowledge. Was this night chosen specifically because the offender knew Nancy would be alone? Or was this simply the first night it happened to be true? We don't know the answer to that. But the preparation we've already discussed, the camera knowledge, the vulnerability targeting, suggests this wasn't purely impulsive. If the offender had been watching Nancy's home and waiting for the right moment, They would have needed to know when she was most vulnerable. And Nancy being alone overnight is exactly that moment. Second, the timing maximized the discovery delay. Nancy was taken late Saturday night or very early Sunday morning. She wasn't reported missing until Sunday around noon. That's a significant head start for an offender. If Nancy had been taken on a weekday morning, when she might have had appointments or expected phone calls, she could have been reported missing within hours. But a weekend? Late Saturday into Sunday morning? When the only alarm would be missing a church service. That's a much longer window. And here's what makes it more interesting. Nancy attended church regularly. That routine was predictable. If you knew Nancy went to church every Sunday morning, you'd know that Sunday morning was when her absence would be noticed. So taking her late Saturday night gives you the maximum amount of time before discovery, while still accounting for the fact that she will eventually be missed. That's not the timing of someone acting impulsively. That's the timing of someone who understands routine and exploits it. Third, the timing coincides with a weekend when Savannah Guthrie's schedule was affected by her professional obligations. Savannah Guthrie is the anchor of NBC's Today Show. In late January and early February 2026, NBC was providing coverage of international events, including the Winter Olympics. We don't know Savannah's exact schedule that weekend. We don't know if she was traveling, working remotely, or available locally. But we do know that major media events create scheduling demands that can make it harder for people to maintain regular check-ins with family. Is it possible the offender knew about these scheduling pressures? Is it possible they chose this weekend specifically because they knew Savannah might be less available than usual? We can't prove that. But it's the kind of detail that investigators examine when they're building a profile of how much the offender knew about the family. If this was purely random, the timing would be coincidental. If this was targeted, the timing would be strategic. The evidence we have suggests strategy. Now let's talk about Nancy's routine, because this is where targeting becomes even more apparent. Nancy attended church regularly. According to multiple sources, this was a known pattern. She was a faithful attendee. People at her congregation knew her. They expected to see her. When she didn't show up on February 1st, someone noticed. That's how the alarm was raised. But think about what it means for an offender to know that routine. If you know someone goes to church every Sunday morning, you know several things. 1. They'll be expected somewhere at a specific time. If they don't show up, people will notice relatively quickly. 2. Sunday morning is a predictable window. You can plan around it. 3. Saturday night is the optimal time to act if you want the longest possible delay before discovery, because no one expects to see the victim until Sunday morning. This is exactly the timing that was used. Nancy was taken late Saturday night. She was reported missing Sunday late morning when she didn't show up for church. That's either an incredible coincidence, or it's deliberate exploitation of a known routine. Let's consider both possibilities honestly. Possibility 1. Coincidence. An offender happened to choose that night. Happened to act during a window that maximized discovery delay. Happened to target a woman whose church routine would trigger concern at exactly the right time to give them a significant head start. All of that is technically possible. Coincidences happen. Possibility 2. Exploitation. An offender knew Nancy's routine. Knew she attended church Sunday mornings. Knew she'd be alone Saturday night. Knew that taking her late Saturday would give them the maximum window before she was reported missing, while still being confident she would eventually be reported missing because of the church routine. Which explanation fits the evidence better? If you combine the timing with everything else, the camera knowledge, the vulnerability targeting, the confidence of movement on the property, the pattern points toward someone who had information. Not guesses. Information. And here's one more detail about timing that doesn't get discussed enough. Why this exact night? If an offender had been surveilling Nancy's home and waiting for an opportunity, there would have been other Saturday nights. Other times when Nancy was alone. So why January 31st into February 1st, 2026? We don't have a confirmed answer to that question. But investigators always ask it, because the answer can reveal motive or opportunity. Was there something specific about that weekend that made it the right time? Was there a triggering event? A financial pressure? A deadline? Or was this simply when the offender was ready? We don't know. But the specificity of the timing adds another layer to the targeting question. This wasn't random selection. This was a chosen moment. And the person who chose it had to know enough about Nancy's life to recognize that this was the moment. If you've been following along carefully, you're starting to see a pattern. Camera knowledge, vulnerability knowledge, timing knowledge, routine knowledge. Each piece individually might be explainable, but together, they create a picture of an offender who came to Nancy's home with preparation. And preparation requires information. So where did that information come from? Before we explore that question, I want to address something directly. If you're still watching this video, it's because you're thinking critically about this case. You're not just passively consuming true crime content, you're analyzing it. That's exactly what this channel is about. We don't sensationalize. We don't speculate wildly. We examine evidence and ask intelligent questions. If that's the kind of content you want more of, subscribe to the Last Case Records. Because we're going to keep doing this kind of deep analysis on cases that deserve serious attention. Now, let's talk about the ransom demand. Because this is where the knowledge question becomes unavoidable. After Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on February 1, 2026, her family began receiving ransom demands. There were multiple communications. Some were later determined to be hoaxes. Most notably the text sent by Derek Colella, a California man who was arrested on February 5, 2026, and charged federally with transmitting a ransom demand and telephonic harassment. Colella admitted he sent the texts to see if the family would respond. He has not been charged with any involvement in Nancy's actual abduction, and his case is separate from the investigation into her disappearance. But there were other ransom communications that law enforcement took seriously. Communications that demanded payment in Bitcoin in exchange for Nancy's return. The exact amount demanded has not been fully disclosed publicly, but it's been described as substantial. The demands came with deadlines. They referenced specific details about Nancy. And they demanded cryptocurrency. Let's talk about what that tells us. First, demanding Bitcoin specifically requires a certain level of technical knowledge. Bitcoin isn't cash. It's not a wire transfer. It's a cryptocurrency that operates on a decentralized blockchain. To successfully receive and use Bitcoin, you need to understand how to set up a digital wallet, how to provide a receiving address, and how to move funds in a way that preserves anonymity. Not everyone knows how to do this. Especially not everyone who might be desperate or impulsive enough to commit a kidnapping. The fact that the demand was for Bitcoin suggests the offender either had technical knowledge themselves, or had access to someone who did. It also suggests they were confident the family could obtain Bitcoin relatively quickly. Because if you demand something the victim's family can't access, you've undermined your own ransom. That confidence implies knowledge of the family's sophistication and resources. Second, the amount demanded, whatever it was, had to fall within a specific range to be credible. Demand too much, and the family can't pay. Demand too little, and you reveal you don't understand the family's actual resources, which makes you seem less credible and less dangerous. Calculating the right amount requires understanding the difference between public perception of wealth and actual liquid assets. Savannah Guthrie is a nationally recognized journalist. She's the co-anchor of one of the most watched morning shows in America. Public perception might be that she has unlimited resources. But public perception isn't the same as financial reality. Journalists, even high-profile ones, don't necessarily have millions of dollars in liquid assets they can access immediately. They have salaries, yes. They may have investments, real estate, retirement accounts. But converting those into cash or cryptocurrency quickly, during a crisis, is a different matter. So here's the question. Did the ransom demand reflect an understanding of what Savannah Guthrie could realistically access quickly? We don't know the exact amount, so we can't answer that definitively. But law enforcement took the demands seriously, which suggests they weren't wildly unrealistic. And if they weren't wildly unrealistic, that implies the offender had some basis for their calculation. A stranger making assumptions based on Google searches might demand $50 million, thinking that's what TV anchors have. Someone with actual knowledge of the family's financial situation might demand an amount that reflects reality. Which one happened here? We don't know. But it's a question investigators would absolutely be examining. Because ransom amounts that are carefully calibrated often indicate inside knowledge. Third, the timing and delivery of the ransom demands. According to reporting, ransom communications began coming in after Savannah Guthrie made a public plea for her mother's return on February 4, 2026. She appeared on the Today Show and on Instagram, emotionally appealing to whoever had taken her mother. That public plea drew enormous attention. It was covered by every major news outlet. It went viral on social media. And it also signaled to anyone watching that the family was desperate and willing to engage. Some of the ransom demands came in after that public plea. That's not unusual. Kidnappers often wait to see how much attention the case gets and how the family responds before making their demands. But here's what's interesting. The demands referenced specific details about Nancy. Details that indicated the sender had actual knowledge of her, not just knowledge from news reports. What those specific details were hasn't been made public, but law enforcement has indicated that the demands were specific enough to be taken seriously. That level of specificity matters. Hoaxers like Derek Colella send generic messages. Did you get the Bitcoin? We have your mother. No details. No proof of life. Just opportunistic attempts to extort a grieving family. But demands that include specific details about the victim. Details that wouldn't be in news reports, suggest the sender actually has information. And that information had to come from somewhere. Fourth, the cryptocurrency sophistication in context of Nancy's age. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. An offender targeting an elderly victim might reasonably assume the victim's family isn't tech-savvy. Might assume they'd prefer a cash demand or a wire transfer. Might avoid cryptocurrency because it seems too complicated for an older demographic. But the demand was for Bitcoin anyway. That suggests the offender was confident the family could navigate cryptocurrency. That suggests they knew enough about the family to know they were capable of obtaining and transferring Bitcoin. That's not an assumption you make about an 84-year-old woman's family unless you know something about that family. Savannah Guthrie is a national television anchor. She's media savvy. She has access to resources and expertise. An offender who knew that might feel confident demanding Bitcoin. An offender who didn't know that might hesitate. The fact that Bitcoin was demanded suggests knowledge of the family's capability. Now, let's address the counterargument. It's entirely possible the offender demanded Bitcoin simply because Bitcoin is what criminals demand now. It's become the default in ransom cases because it's harder to trace than traditional financial instruments. That's a fair point. But even if the Bitcoin demand itself doesn't indicate specific knowledge, the amount and the specificity of the demands do. And when you combine the ransom demands with everything else, the camera knowledge, the vulnerability targeting, the timing, the pattern continues to point in the same direction. This offender had information. He didn't guess. He knew. And the question investigators are almost certainly asking is, who had that information, and how did the offender get it? Because here's the reality of how information travels. Information doesn't exist in a vacuum. When an offender demonstrates specific knowledge about a victim, their routines, their vulnerabilities, their security systems, their family's financial capacity, that knowledge had to originate somewhere. And in cases like this, investigators work through what's called an access circle analysis. It's a systematic way of mapping who had what knowledge, and how that knowledge could have traveled from the people who legitimately possessed it to someone who used it for criminal purposes. Let's break this down into tiers. Tier 1. Intimate knowledge. This is the innermost circle. People who had regular direct access to Nancy and her home. Family members would be in this tier. They'd know Nancy's routines, her medical needs, her physical limitations, the layout of her home, where the cameras were positioned, when she was alone, and the family's general financial situation. Law enforcement cleared all of Nancy's immediate family members on February 24, 2026. Sheriff Chris Nanos stated explicitly, "All Guthrie siblings and their spouses have been cleared as possible suspects." That clearance is significant. It's not something law enforcement does lightly, especially in a case with this much public attention. When they clear family members publicly, it typically means they have solid alibi evidence, digital footprints, and no forensic connections to the crime scene. So we're not looking at Tier 1 as direct suspects. But Tier 1 is still relevant to the analysis, because people in this tier possess the type of knowledge the offender demonstrated. Also in Tier 1 would be anyone who provided regular care or services inside the home. If Nancy had a home health aide, a housekeeper, or anyone else who came to the house regularly, they'd have similar access to information. We don't have public confirmation of whether Nancy had regular caregivers outside the family, but it's something investigators would examine. The question isn't whether people in Tier 1 committed the crime. The question is whether information from Tier 1 could have traveled to someone outside it. Tier 2. Observable knowledge. This is the middle circle. People who had enough proximity to Nancy's life to observe patterns, but who didn't necessarily have intimate access to her home or personal details. Neighbors would be in this tier. If you live on the same street, you notice when someone comes and goes. You notice routines. You might know that an elderly woman lives in a particular house, that she leaves for church on Sunday mornings, that family members visit on certain days. But you probably wouldn't know about medical conditions, medication needs, or whether the doorbell camera has an active cloud subscription. That's inside information. Church community members would also be in Tier 2. Nancy attended church regularly. People there knew her. They'd notice her patterns, when she arrived, whether she came alone, whether she seemed frail or healthy. But again, they wouldn't necessarily know the layout of her home or the details of her security system. Service providers, landscapers, delivery drivers, utility workers might occasionally see the property, but they wouldn't have the sustained access needed to gather the kind of operational intelligence the offender demonstrated. Tier 2 is important because it represents people who could have observed Nancy and identified her as a potential target based on visible factors. Elderly, living in an affluent area, regular routine. But Tier 2 alone doesn't explain the camera knowledge. It doesn't explain the confidence of movement on the property. It doesn't explain the vulnerability exploitation. For that, you need information that originated in Tier 1. Tier 3, researched knowledge. This is the outer circle. People who had no direct connection to Nancy but who researched her from a distance. Someone could theoretically learn that Nancy Guthrie is Savannah Guthrie's mother through public records and online research. They could find the address through property records. They could identify the general area and the type of neighborhood. But research alone has limits. You can't research someone's daily routine from the internet. You can't find out whether they have limited mobility unless you observe them directly. You can't discover that their doorbell camera isn't recording to the cloud without inside knowledge or physical surveillance. So Tier 3 is where targeting could begin. Someone identifies Nancy as connected to wealth and living in an accessible area. But it's not where the detailed operational knowledge comes from. That knowledge requires Tier 2 observation or Tier 1 access. Tier 1. Intimate knowledge. This is the innermost circle. People who had regular direct access to Nancy and her home. Family members would be in this tier. They'd know Nancy's routines, her medical needs, her physical limitations, the layout of her home, where the cameras were positioned, when she was alone, and the family's general financial situation. Law enforcement cleared all of Nancy's immediate family members on February 24, 2026. Sheriff Chris Nanos stated explicitly, "All Guthrie siblings and their spouses have been cleared as possible suspects." That clearance is significant. It's not something law enforcement does lightly, especially in a case with this much public attention. When they clear family members publicly, it typically means they have solid alibi evidence, digital footprints, and no forensic connections to the crime scene. So we're not looking at Tier 1 as direct suspects. But Tier 1 is still relevant to the analysis, because people in this tier possess the type of knowledge the offender demonstrated. Also in Tier 1 would be anyone who provided regular care or services inside the home. If Nancy had a home health aide, a housekeeper, or anyone else who came to the house regularly, they'd have similar access to information. We don't have public confirmation of whether Nancy had regular caregivers outside the family, but it's something investigators would examine. The question isn't whether people in Tier 1 committed the crime. The question is whether information from Tier 1 could have traveled to someone outside it. Tier 2. Observable knowledge. This is the middle circle. People who had enough proximity to Nancy's life to observe patterns, but who didn't necessarily have intimate access to her home or personal details. Neighbors would be in this tier. If you live on the same street, you notice when someone comes and goes. You notice routines. You might know that an elderly woman lives in a particular house, that she leaves for church on Sunday mornings, that family members visit on certain days. But you probably wouldn't know about medical conditions, medication needs, or whether the doorbell camera has an active cloud subscription. That's inside information. Church community members would also be in Tier 2. Nancy attended church regularly. People there knew her. They'd notice her patterns, when she arrived, whether she came alone, whether she seemed frail or healthy. But again, they wouldn't necessarily know the layout of her home or the details of her security system. Service providers, landscapers, delivery drivers, utility workers might occasionally see the property, but they wouldn't have the sustained access needed to gather the kind of operational intelligence the offender demonstrated. Tier 2 is important because it represents people who could have observed Nancy and identified her as a potential target based on visible factors. Elderly, living in an affluent area, regular routine. But Tier 2 alone doesn't explain the camera knowledge. It doesn't explain the confidence of movement on the property. It doesn't explain the vulnerability exploitation. For that, you need information that originated in Tier 1. Tier 3, researched knowledge. This is the outer circle. People who had no direct connection to Nancy but who researched her from a distance. Someone could theoretically learn that Nancy Guthrie is Savannah Guthrie's mother through public records and online research. They could find the address through property records. They could identify the general area and the type of neighborhood. But research alone has limits. You can't research someone's daily routine from the internet. You can't find out whether they have limited mobility unless you observe them directly. You can't discover that their doorbell camera isn't recording to the cloud without inside knowledge or physical surveillance. So Tier 3 is where targeting could begin. Someone identifies Nancy as connected to wealth and living in an accessible area. But it's not where the detailed operational knowledge comes from. That knowledge requires Tier 2 observation or Tier 1 access. Now here's where it gets important. Information transfer between tiers. Knowledge that originates in Tier 1 can travel outward through social connections. A family member mentions to a friend that their elderly mother has been having mobility issues. That's a normal, innocent conversation. But now someone in Tier 2 has Tier 1 knowledge. A neighbor mentions to an acquaintance that the elderly woman down the street is the mother of a famous TV anchor. Again, normal conversation. But information has traveled. A service provider mentions to someone outside the area that they work in an affluent neighborhood where a lot of homes have security cameras that aren't actively monitored. That's not about Nancy specifically, but it's tactical information. This is how knowledge migrates from people who have legitimate access to people who don't. And this is exactly what investigators examine when they're trying to understand how an offender could have known what they clearly knew. They interview everyone in Tier 1. They ask about who they've talked to, who's been to the house, who knows about Nancy's situation. They canvass Tier 2. They talk to neighbors, church members, anyone who might have observed Nancy or had conversations about her. And they look for connections between the tiers. Because the person who committed this crime either had direct access to Tier 1 knowledge, or they knew someone who did. There's another factor we need to consider. Savannah Guthrie's public profile. Nancy wasn't just an elderly woman. She was the mother of one of the most recognizable journalists in America. That creates a specific type of risk. Public figures' families are sometimes targeted specifically because of the public figure's prominence. The assumption is that wealth and resources are available. The assumption is that the family will be desperate to resolve the situation quietly. But targeting based on public profile still requires specific knowledge about the actual family member. Savannah's career is public. Nancy's address is discoverable through property records. But the operational details, when Nancy was alone, how the house was secured, her physical vulnerabilities, those still required either surveillance or inside knowledge. So even if the initial targeting came from knowing about Savannah, the execution required knowing about Nancy. And that brings us back to the access circle. Someone knew enough about Nancy to plan this abduction with precision. Someone knew when she'd be alone. Knew she was vulnerable. Knew where the camera was. Knew the layout well enough to move with confidence. That knowledge didn't come from thin air. It came from someone. And it either stayed with that someone, or it traveled to someone else. Law enforcement's job is to map that travel. To identify who knew what, when they knew it, and who they might have shared it with, intentionally or unintentionally. Because here's the difficult truth about cases like this. Most abductions of elderly victims from their homes aren't committed by complete strangers. That doesn't mean family did it. Again, family has been cleared. But it often means the offender had some connection, however distant, to the victim's social or service circle. A friend of a friend. An acquaintance of a neighbor. Someone who did work at the house years ago. Someone who heard about the family through extended networks. These connections can be difficult to trace, which is why these investigations take time. But the connections exist, because the knowledge exists. And knowledge comes from somewhere. Now we need to step back and ask the harder questions. The questions that don't have clean answers yet. In any complex criminal investigation, there are questions that evidence raises but can't yet answer. These aren't rhetorical questions. They're not designed to lead you toward a specific conclusion. They're genuine investigative questions. The kind law enforcement asks behind closed doors, the kind that shape strategy and focus resources. Let's go through them carefully. Question 1. How long was Nancy under surveillance? If the offender had the kind of detailed knowledge we've discussed, they had to acquire it somehow. Surveillance is one method. If someone watched Nancy's home over a period of weeks or months, they could learn her routine. When she left for church. When family visited. When she was alone. But surveillance has limits. You can observe from outside, but you can't learn the layout of the interior. You can't identify which cameras are recording unless you get close enough to test them or unless someone tells you. So the question is, how much surveillance would have been necessary to acquire the knowledge the offender demonstrated? And the follow-up. Did anyone notice? Surveillance in residential neighborhoods is risky. Neighbors notice unfamiliar cars. They notice people who don't belong. They remember patterns. Law enforcement would have canvassed the area, asking residents if they saw anything unusual in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. If someone was conducting sustained surveillance, there's a chance someone noticed. But if no one noticed, that raises a different possibility. The surveillance was brief because the offender already had most of the information they needed from another source. Question 2. Had there been prior contact or attempted contact? Sometimes, before an abduction, there are warning signs. Unusual phone calls. Strangers at the door. Vehicles that drive by repeatedly. Attempts to engage the victim in conversation. We don't have public information about whether Nancy experienced anything like this in the weeks before her disappearance. But it's a question investigators always ask family members. Did Nancy mention anything? Did she feel uncomfortable? Did she notice anyone watching her? If the answer is yes, it provides investigative leads. If the answer is no, it suggests the offender kept their distance until the moment they acted. Question 3. Why this exact night? We've discussed the timing, late Saturday night into early Sunday morning, when Nancy was alone and wouldn't be missed until church. But why January 31st specifically? Was there something about that date that made it the right time? A triggering event? A financial pressure? A deadline? Or was this simply when the offender was ready? In some cases, timing is chosen based on external factors. The victim's schedule, a family member's travel, some event that creates opportunity. In other cases, timing is chosen based on the offender's circumstances. When they finally get desperate enough, when they've finished planning, when they've acquired the resources they need. Which one applies here? We don't know. But the answer would tell us a lot about motive. Question 4. Was there a financial trigger? Ransom-motivated abductions often correlate with financial desperation. Someone loses a job. Someone has gambling debts. Someone faces eviction or foreclosure. The pressure builds until they act. If investigators can identify a suspect, one of the first things they'd look at is financial records in the weeks and months before the abduction. Were there signs of desperation? Large debts? Sudden expenses? This kind of background work is standard in ransom cases, because financial motive often leaves a paper trail. But without a publicly identified suspect, we don't have that information yet. Question 5. How many people were involved? The doorbell footage shows one person. But was that person acting alone? Abducting an elderly woman with limited mobility from her home and transporting her somewhere else is a significant logistical challenge for one person. It's possible. But it's easier with help. A second person to drive. A second person to keep watch. A second person to help manage the victim. Law enforcement hasn't publicly stated whether they believe one or more offenders were involved. But it's a critical question because if there were multiple people, that multiplies the opportunities for someone to talk, to make a mistake, to leave evidence. And it means the knowledge we've discussed was shared between at least two people, which creates additional points of investigative focus. Question 6. Where is Nancy now? This is the question that drives everything. Is Nancy still alive? She's 84 years old. She has medical conditions that require daily medication. It's been over 3 months since she was taken. Law enforcement has said there's no proof she's alive, but they continue to investigate as though she might be. That suggests they don't have evidence confirming death, but they also don't have evidence confirming life. The uncertainty is agonizing for the family. But it also affects investigative strategy. If Nancy is deceased, this becomes a homicide investigation with a focus on recovering remains and building a case for prosecution. If there's any chance she's alive, resources continue to focus on ransom communication, potential locations where she might be held, and the urgency of finding her quickly. We don't know which scenario investigators are prioritizing, but we know they're working both angles, because they have to. Question 7. What evidence exists that hasn't been made public? In any active investigation, law enforcement holds back information for strategic reasons. Details that only the offender would know. Forensic evidence that could link a suspect to the scene. Digital communications that are still being traced. We've analyzed what's publicly available. But there's almost certainly more. DNA evidence, for example. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that Nancy's blood was found at the scene. But was any other biological evidence found? Evidence from the offender? If so, that evidence is being processed, compared to databases, and potentially run through genetic genealogy services that can identify suspects through distant family connections. We don't know what else exists. But the fact that the investigation remains active suggests investigators have leads they haven't disclosed. Question 8. Why hasn't there been an arrest? This might be the most frustrating question for the public. It's been over 3 months. There's physical evidence. There's video footage. There's a massive reward. So why hasn't anyone been arrested in connection with Nancy's abduction? There are several possible explanations. 1. Investigators have a suspect but don't yet have enough evidence to charge them. They're building the case, waiting for forensic results, conducting interviews, establishing timeline and opportunity. 2. Investigators have multiple persons of interest but haven't been able to narrow it to a specific suspect with sufficient evidence. 3. The investigation has identified investigative leads but hasn't yet connected them to a specific individual. 4. The evidence is more complex than it appears, and investigators are working through technical or legal challenges. Any of these scenarios could explain the delay. None of them mean the investigation isn't progressing. They just mean we're not seeing the progress publicly. These questions don't have answers yet, but they frame what investigators are working toward. And they remind us that what we see publicly is only a fraction of what's actually happening behind the scenes. Now, before we go further, we need to do something responsible analysts always do. Challenge our own assumptions. Because if we've built a case for targeting based on the evidence, we also need to examine where that case might be wrong. Let's be honest about the limitations of the analysis we've just done. We've examined evidence that suggests Nancy Guthrie was specifically targeted by someone with prior knowledge of her vulnerabilities, routine, and household circumstances. But suggesting isn't proving. And responsible analysis requires entertaining alternative explanations, even when they're less compelling. So let's go through the counterarguments. Counterpoint 1. A capable stranger could have done all of this. The camera knowledge, the confidence on the property, the timing, all of it could theoretically be accomplished by a skilled offender with no prior connection to Nancy. Here's how that works. Professional criminals conduct reconnaissance. They choose targets based on observable factors: elderly victim, affluent neighborhood, accessible property. They scout during the day, noting security cameras. Doorbell cameras are increasingly common and are usually positioned in predictable locations near the front door. They watch the house over several days or weeks, learning the routine. When lights go on and off. When people arrive and leave. When the target is alone. They choose their timing based on that observation. Late Saturday night when an elderly person is likely to be asleep and alone. The physical vulnerability could be assessed visually. An 84-year-old woman clearly has limitations. The ransom amount could be calculated based on public information about Savannah Guthrie's career and estimated salary. None of this requires inside knowledge. It just requires patience, observation, and criminal skill. This is a legitimate alternative explanation. And we need to acknowledge it, because overcommitting to the inside knowledge theory without considering that a stranger could accomplish the same things is a form of investigative bias. Counterpoint 2. Church attendance is observable from outside. We emphasized Nancy's church routine as evidence of inside knowledge. But church attendance isn't secret information. If someone surveilled Nancy for even 2 Sundays, they'd see the pattern. She leaves Sunday morning. She's gone for a few hours. She returns. That's enough to know that Sunday morning is when her absence will be noticed, and Saturday night is the optimal time to act. No insider access required. Just observation. Counterpoint 3. The ransom demand might not have been sophisticated. We analyzed the Bitcoin demand as evidence of technical knowledge and calculated targeting. But demanding Bitcoin is becoming standard in ransom cases, not because offenders are sophisticated, but because they've seen it in news reports and think it's what you're supposed to demand. The amount could have been arbitrary. We don't actually know if it was carefully calibrated to Savannah's real financial capacity, because we don't know what the demand was or what Savannah can actually access. We assume sophistication based on the fact that law enforcement took the demands seriously. But law enforcement takes all ransom demands seriously in active abduction cases. That doesn't necessarily mean the demand was well calculated. Counterpoint 4. The camera behavior could be luck or common sense. The masked figure walked directly to the doorbell camera and tampered with it. We interpreted that as evidence of prior knowledge. But it's also possible the offender simply looked for cameras as they approached, spotted the doorbell camera in the moment, and disabled it based on common sense. Doorbell cameras are usually positioned near the front door at eye level. They're designed to be visible enough to deter criminals. An observant person approaching the porch could spot it and react, even without prior knowledge. The potted plant being used to cover the lens could have been improvisation. The plant was right there. It was the obvious tool to use. This doesn't require prior visits. It just requires situational awareness. Counterpoint 5. Some of these factors are coincidental. Timing could be random chance. The offender could have driven through the neighborhood looking for opportunity and happened to find Nancy alone that night. The vulnerability targeting could be visual assessment on arrival, not advanced research. The confidence of movement could be adrenaline and determination, not familiarity. When we analyze cases after the fact, we look for patterns. And humans are very good at finding patterns. Sometimes even when they're not really there. It's called apophenia. Seeing meaningful connections in random data. We need to guard against that. Just because multiple factors align doesn't automatically mean they were engineered. Sometimes things align by chance. Counterpoint 6. We don't have the full investigative file. This is perhaps the most important limitation to acknowledge. Everything we've analyzed is based on publicly available information. We don't know what evidence law enforcement has that hasn't been released. We don't know what witnesses have said in interviews. We don't know what forensic analysis has revealed. We don't know if there are suspects being investigated privately. Our analysis is based on a fraction of what investigators know. And that means our conclusions, however well-reasoned, are inherently limited. Investigators might have information that completely changes the picture. They might know things that make the targeting theory irrelevant. Or they might have evidence that confirms it beyond what we can see publicly. We don't know. And intellectual honesty requires admitting that. So where does that leave us? We've built a case based on available evidence that Nancy's abduction shows signs of targeting and prior knowledge. But we've also acknowledged that alternative explanations exist. A skilled stranger with no connection to Nancy could theoretically have accomplished everything we've discussed. Some of the factors we've highlighted could be coincidental or explainable without invoking inside knowledge. And we're working with incomplete information. All of that is true. But here's what's also true. The pattern remains. Camera knowledge. Vulnerability exploitation. Strategic timing. Ransom sophistication. Confidence on the property. Each piece individually might be explainable as coincidence or skill. But collectively, they create a picture that investigators would absolutely examine through the lens of possible prior knowledge. And that's not speculation. That's standard investigative practice. When multiple factors align in ways that suggest preparation and specific knowledge, investigators work through the access circle. They examine who knew what. They trace information flow. They build timelines of who had opportunity to acquire knowledge and when. That's what's happening right now behind the scenes, whether we see it publicly or not. So our analysis isn't definitive. But it's also not unfounded. It's a careful examination of what publicly available evidence suggests. And what it suggests is that this case is worth looking at through the lens of targeting. Now let's talk about where things stand today. As of this recording, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 100 days. She was last seen on the night of January 31st, 2026. She was reported missing on February 1st. And despite an intensive investigation involving the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI, she has not been found. Here's what we know about the current status of the investigation. Rewards and public appeals. The FBI initially offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to Nancy's whereabouts. That reward has since been increased to $100,000. On February 24, 2026, Savannah Guthrie announced that the family was adding $1 million to that reward, bringing the total to $1.1 million. That's a significant amount. And it indicates the family's desperation and commitment to finding Nancy. Public appeals have continued. Savannah has appeared on television and social media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The family has used the phrase "blow on the embers of hope," asking the public not to let Nancy's case fade from attention. Law enforcement statements. On February 24, 2026, Sheriff Chris Nanos made a significant public statement. He said that all of Nancy Guthrie's siblings and their spouses had been cleared as possible suspects. That's important for two reasons. First, it removes the immediate family from public suspicion, which is appropriate given that law enforcement found no evidence connecting them to the crime. Second, it signals that investigators have moved beyond the innermost circle and are looking outward. Sheriff Nanos has also stated publicly that there's no proof Nancy is still alive, but that investigators are proceeding as though she might be. That suggests they don't have evidence confirming death, but the passage of time and her medical needs make survival increasingly unlikely. The Colella case. As mentioned earlier, Derek Colella of Hawthorne, California, was arrested on February 5, 2026, and charged with transmitting false ransom demands. Colella admitted he sent text messages to the Guthrie family claiming to have Nancy and demanding Bitcoin. He said he did it to see if the family would respond. He has been charged federally under 18 U.S.C. Section 875A, transmitting ransom demand, and 47 U.S.C. Section 223A, 3, telephonic harassment. His trial is scheduled for June 23, 2026, in Tucson. Colella has not been charged with any involvement in Nancy's actual abduction. His case is separate, a cruel hoax that added to the family's suffering but doesn't appear connected to the real crime. Physical evidence. We know that Nancy's blood was found at the scene and confirmed through DNA testing. We know her personal belongings, glasses, phone, bank cards, were left behind. We know there was no sign of ransacking or burglary. Beyond that, law enforcement hasn't disclosed what other forensic evidence was recovered. But in cases like this, investigators typically collect DNA from surfaces, clothing, or biological material left by the offender. Fingerprints, though gloves likely prevented that here. Digital evidence from phones, computers, and Nancy's devices. Surveillance footage from neighboring properties. If any of this evidence has led to suspects, it hasn't been made public. What we're waiting for. The investigation is active. That means investigators are still pursuing leads, analyzing evidence, and conducting interviews. But there hasn't been an arrest in connection with Nancy's abduction. There hasn't been a public identification of a suspect or person of interest. There hasn't been any update on Nancy's whereabouts or condition. The silence is difficult. For the family, it's agonizing. For the public, it's frustrating. But silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Investigations of this complexity take time. Forensic analysis takes time. Tracing financial records, digital communications, and potential suspect connections takes time. And investigators often don't announce progress publicly until they're ready to make an arrest, because public disclosure can compromise the investigation. So we wait. What the public can still do. The FBI tip line remains active. 1-800-CALL-FBI. Tips can also be submitted online at tips.fbi.gov. The $1.1 million reward is still being offered. If you lived in the Catalina foothills area of Tucson in late January 2026, think back. Did you see unfamiliar vehicles on your street? Did you notice anyone watching properties or lingering in the area? Did you see anything unusual late at night on January 31st or early morning February 1st? Something that seemed insignificant at the time might be critical now. A neighbor's Ring camera might have captured a vehicle. A late-night dog walker might have seen something. Someone driving through the area might remember a detail. These cases are often solved by small pieces of information from people who didn't think what they saw mattered. It matters. Why this case still demands attention. Nancy Guthrie is someone's mother. Someone's grandmother. She's a person with a life, a routine, a community that misses her. She's 84 years old with medical conditions that make every day she's missing more critical. But beyond Nancy's individual case, there's a broader reason this matters. If Nancy was specifically targeted based on her vulnerability and her family's prominence, that means predators are studying potential victims, watching them, learning their routines, exploiting their weaknesses, understanding how that targeting works, how information travels from legitimate access to criminal use, helps protect other potential victims. It helps families understand what security measures matter. It helps communities recognize warning signs. It helps law enforcement identify patterns and prevent future cases. So this isn't just about finding Nancy, though that's the immediate and most important goal. It's about understanding how crimes like this happen so we can make them harder to commit. And if you've watched this entire video, if you've followed this analysis carefully, you're part of that understanding. You're thinking critically about how offenders operate. You're asking intelligent questions. You're not just consuming true crime content, you're engaging with it analytically. That's what this channel is about. If you want more evidence-based analysis like this, cases examined carefully, factually, without sensationalism, subscribe to the Last Case Records. Because we're going to keep doing this work. We're going to keep asking hard questions. We're going to keep demanding that true crime content respects both victims and evidence. Now, let me bring this to a close. We started this video with a question. Was Nancy Guthrie specifically targeted? And after examining the evidence, the camera knowledge, the vulnerability exploitation, the strategic timing, the ransom calculation, the pattern of preparation, we have an answer. Not a definitive answer. Not proof. but an answer grounded in evidence. Yes, the available evidence suggests Nancy was likely chosen in advance by someone who had specific knowledge about her life. The alternative, that this was purely random, that every factor aligned by coincidence, that a stranger with no connection accomplished all of this through observation and skill alone, is possible. But it requires explaining away a lot of specific details. And when you're an investigator, when you're examining a case like this, you follow the evidence that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions. The evidence here points toward targeting. Someone knew when Nancy would be alone. Someone knew she was vulnerable. Someone knew where the security camera was. Someone moved through that property with confidence. Someone calculated a ransom that law enforcement took seriously. That knowledge came from somewhere. And the most likely source is either direct access to Nancy's life and home, or information passed from someone who had that access. Law enforcement cleared Nancy's immediate family. So we're not looking at the innermost circle as suspects, but we are looking at how knowledge travels outward from that circle. Through social connections, through service relationships, through casual conversations that seemed harmless at the time. This is the work investigators are doing right now. Mapping who knew what. Tracing information flow. Identifying anyone who had both knowledge and opportunity. And that work takes time. But here's what I want you to sit with as we close. Behind all of this analysis, behind the evidence examination, the behavioral profiling, the timeline reconstruction, there's an 84-year-old woman who's been missing for over 3 months. Nancy Guthrie had a routine. She went to church. She had family who loved her. She had a life that mattered. And someone took that from her. Whether that person was a stranger who targeted her based on observation, or someone closer who used inside knowledge, the violation is the same. Nancy was chosen. She was studied. She was taken. And she deserves justice. Her family deserves answers. The investigation continues. Evidence is being processed. Tips are being followed up. Somewhere in the massive amount of information law enforcement has collected, there are pieces that will eventually connect. DNA evidence might link to a suspect through genetic genealogy. Digital forensics might trace communications back to a source. Someone with knowledge might come forward, whether out of guilt or for the reward. These cases are solved through persistence, and through public attention that doesn't let them fade. So if you've made it to the end of this video, you've done something important. You've given Nancy's case your attention. You've thought critically about what the evidence suggests. You've asked questions that matter. Now share that attention. If someone in your network has information, if they lived in the area, if they notice something, if they know anything that could help, the FBI tip line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. Anonymous tips are accepted. The $1.1 million reward is real. And the need for information is urgent. Every day that passes makes it less likely Nancy will be found alive. But it doesn't make justice less important. It doesn't make answers less necessary. It doesn't make this case less worthy of our attention. So here's my final thought. If you're the person who did this, if you're watching this video right now, know this. The investigation hasn't stopped. The evidence is being processed. The access circles are being mapped. You left traces. Everyone does. And those traces lead somewhere. The question isn't whether you'll be identified. The question is when. You can't change what you've done. But you can choose what happens next. Where is Nancy? That's the question that matters most. And it's a question someone out there can answer. If that someone is you, the number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. tips.fbi.gov. The choice is yours. For everyone else, stay informed. Stay engaged. Don't let Nancy's case become just another missing person story that fades from memory. She's someone's mother. She's still out there somewhere. And she deserves to be brought home. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to The Last Case Records for more evidence-based analysis. And remember, justice doesn't require perfection. It requires persistence. Stay vigilant.